The fog rolled in low that October evening, threading through the pines like cold breath, muffling the world until even the nearest trees became grey silhouettes. Marcus Chen stood at the trailhead of Whitethorn Ridge, adjusting the straps on his pack one last time, while his younger sister Emma snapped a photo on her phone. The air tasted of rain and rotting leaves, that particular October sharpness that promised the first snow would come soon to the high country. He was 23, a graduate student in environmental science, and this was supposed to be a routine 3-day solo trek to collect soil samples from the upper watershed for his thesis on heavy metal contamination in alpine streams. He'd done this route twice before, knew every switchback and stream crossing, had even helped maintain the trail markers the previous summer as a volunteer. The Forest Service map was laminated in his pocket, his GPS fully charged, his emergency beacon clipped to his chest strap where he could reach it in seconds. Emma made him promise to check in when he reached the summit camp the next afternoon, made him recite the emergency protocols their father had drilled into both of them since childhood. He grinned, told her not to worry, pulled his hood up against the thickening mist, and disappeared into the trees as the light began to fail. When Marcus didn't call the next day, Emma assumed poor reception. The high ridges were notorious dead zones, and he'd warned her the satellite phone sometimes struggled under heavy canopy. When he missed his planned exit on day 4, she felt the first cold finger of dread touch her spine. She drove immediately to the ranger station, ignoring her parents' reassurances that he'd probably just decided to extend his sample collection. They found his truck still parked at the trailhead, windows beaded with condensation. A receipt for trail mix and water purification tablets dated the day he'd left folded on the dashboard beside a library book on wilderness survival techniques he'd checked out 3 weeks earlier. Within hours, search and rescue teams mobilized with the efficiency of a system that had done this too many times before. Canine units swept the main trail, while helicopters with thermal imaging scanned the canopy in overlapping grid patterns. Volunteers formed lines, walking shoulder to shoulder through the understory, calling his name until their voices went hoarse. They found his first campsite on day 2 of the search, exactly where he'd planned to spend his first night. Tent stakes still in the ground, the fabric itself neatly folded inside its stuff sack, a half-eaten energy bar in a bear canister hung properly from a tree branch, but no sign of struggle or distress, no blood, no torn fabric, no evidence of animal interference. His GPS unit sat powered off inside the tent, which struck the lead searcher as odd because Marcus was known to be meticulous about tracking his routes. The emergency beacon had never been activated. His sleeping bag was rolled and strapped to the pack frame he'd apparently been carrying when he left the camp that morning. The soil samples he'd collected the previous day were carefully labeled and stored in sealed bags. Everything suggested he'd simply packed up to continue his hike and vanished between one breath and the next. The search expanded to cover 40 square miles of rugged terrain, a landscape of steep ravines, limestone sinkholes, and abandoned mining tunnels from the 1890s, when silver prospectors had riddled these mountains with passages that appeared on no modern map. Volunteers combed secondary trails and game paths. Technical rope teams rappelled into ravines too steep for casual hikers. Divers in dry suits checked the deep pools where Coldwater Creek cut through the valley, their underwater lights probing the murky darkness for any sign of a body caught in the current. After 3 weeks, the official search scaled back to periodic sweeps. The teams redeployed to other emergencies, other missing persons who might still be saved. After 6 months, it became a recovery mission, the unspoken assumption being that they were looking for remains, not a survivor. After a year, the file grew cold, just another name in the database of people who'd walked into the wilderness and never returned. Emma couldn't accept it. She quit her job as a graphic designer, cashed out her modest retirement account, and enrolled in wilderness first aid courses, emergency response training, technical climbing workshops. She learned to read topographic maps the way her brother had, understanding contour lines and watershed drainage patterns with an intimacy that came from obsession. She returned to those hills every season, walking grids with a handheld radio and a notebook that grew thick with coordinates, weather patterns, geological features, and questions no one could answer. She documented everything: the locations of abandoned mine shafts, seasonal water sources, areas where compass readings went haywire due to iron deposits, caves that weren't on any official survey, animal migration routes that might provide food for someone desperate enough to know how to trap and hunt. She became a fixture on the trails, the woman who never stopped looking, whose lean frame and weathered face eventually mirrored the hardened determination in her eyes. Marcus's parents established a foundation to support families of the missing, lobbying for better tracking technology on public lands, for mandatory beacon requirements, for improved coordination between search agencies. His father, a retired aerospace engineer, studied search protocols with the same analytical precision he'd once applied to satellite trajectories, wrote detailed letters to legislators, appeared on local news segments pleading for any information, any sighting, anything that might crack open the mystery of how his son had simply ceased to exist. His mother couldn't go near the mountains anymore. The sight of pine trees triggered panic attacks. She'd wake in the night, convinced she could hear Marcus calling for help, his voice muffled by distance and stone. The family existed in a kind of suspended grief, unable to mourn fully because there was no body, no closure, only an absence that grew heavier with each passing year, like a stone slowly crushing their chests. Emma kept his room untouched, his books still on the shelves, his climbing gear hanging in the closet, a shrine to someone who might still walk through the door. By year 5, the story had faded from public attention, replaced by fresher tragedies and more recent mysteries. By year 7, even the Foundation's volunteers had dwindled to a core group of family members and other parents who'd lost children to the wilderness. Emma still hiked those trails, now accompanied by a search dog named Ranger. She'd trained herself from a rescue puppy, teaching him to follow scent trails and alert on human remains with a patience born from having nothing but time and purpose. She'd become lean and weather-hardened, her hands calloused from rope work, her knowledge of the wilderness as deep as any rangers or guides. She'd found remnants of other missing hikers over the years, helped close 2 cold cases, recovered bodies that gave other families the closure hers had been denied, but never a trace of Marcus, not a shred of clothing, not a bone fragment, nothing. She began to systematically map the old mine system, suspecting he might have sheltered in one during a sudden storm and become disoriented in the darkness, lost in the miles of branching tunnels where one wrong turn could lead to a dead end or a vertical shaft dropping into flooding pools of water. The tunnels were treacherous, many collapsed or flooded, and the historical records were incomplete, sketchy maps drawn by men who'd been more concerned with ore veins than accurate surveying. In year 9, everything changed. A surveying team working for a renewable energy project discovered something unusual while doing geological assessments for wind turbine placement. A narrow canyon system not accurately marked on any current map. A geological anomaly accessible only through a rockfall area that had shifted significantly in a landslide documented 8 years prior by satellite imagery analysis. The canyon had likely been inaccessible for decades before that slide temporarily opened a passage through what had been a solid rock face, then closed it again when secondary collapses filled in the opening from below. Emma obtained the survey data through a Freedom of Information request, studied the terrain models and elevation profiles for weeks, and realized the canyon ran parallel to Whitethorn Ridge, hidden behind a false ridgeline that created an optical illusion of continuous slope where there was actually a deep cleft in the mountain. If someone had found that opening in the brief window it existed, perhaps investigating what looked like a cave entrance or mining tunnel, They could have descended into a terrain completely isolated from the search grids, invisible to aerial surveillance, beyond the range of any organized ground search. She requested permission to explore it, presenting her case with maps and geological analysis and the weight of 9 years of searching. The authorities were skeptical, but allowed a supervised descent with a full technical team, liability waivers, and emergency extraction protocols in place. What she found at the bottom changed everything. The canyon floor was a microclimate, sheltered from the worst winds by the high walls, slightly warmer than the exposed ridges above, with a spring-fed pool that never froze completely even in winter, and dense undergrowth sustained by the reliable water source. Tucked beneath an overhang that would be invisible from above was a makeshift shelter constructed from branches, tarp fragments that had clearly been scavenged from his camping gear, and stones carefully stacked to create a windbreak and fire reflector. Inside, arranged with eerie precision that spoke of endless time and desperate need for order, were objects that stopped Emma's heart. A water-damaged backpack with Marcus's university ID card still visible in its plastic sleeve. A journal wrapped in multiple layers of plastic bags and sealed with duct tape. A small solar charger jury-rigged to a salvaged flashlight using wire stripped from headphone cords. A collection of handmade tools including knives fashioned from split rock and bound with plant fiber, and dozens upon dozens of tally marks carved into the rock face with methodical care. 4 vertical lines crossed by a 5th, repeated hundreds of times, marching across the stone in neat rows, like prisoners counting their days in a cell with no door. Emma's hands shook so badly that the ranger had to help her open the journal. The first entry was dated 2 days after Marcus had disappeared, the handwriting recognizably his, but already showing stress in the sharp angles and incomplete letters. He'd fallen, the journal explained in terse, almost clinical language, through a gap in the rocks while investigating what he thought was an old mine entrance he'd noticed the previous day. Marked it on his map to explore on the return hike. The fall had been 20 feet, enough to sprain his ankle badly and knock the wind from his lungs, sending his pack bouncing ahead of him to wedge in the rocks below. But the real catastrophe was the rock slide that followed seconds later, triggered by his passage or perhaps just the random lottery of geological instability, sealing the entrance above him with tons of debris. He'd shouted himself hoarse, screamed until his throat bled, the journal said. He'd tried to climb out repeatedly, but the walls were smooth limestone polished by ancient water, and with an injured ankle he couldn't generate the strength or reach needed to ascend the chimney sections. His emergency beacon had been smashed in the fall, the plastic housing cracked, and the electronics dead. His GPS was back in the tent because he'd been doing short day hikes from base camp. He'd had 3 days of food in the pack, and a water filter. That was all. The journal detailed his initial panic, the hyperventilating terror of being buried alive, the desperate calculations of how long his food would last, how long before hypothermia or dehydration would kill him. Then it showed his methodical shift to survival, the moment when panic crystallized into purpose. He rationed food, eating just enough to maintain function. He found the spring, tested the water, thanked whatever geological fortune had put a reliable source in his prison. He built the shelter using techniques he'd learned from wilderness manuals and YouTube videos watched years ago, never imagining he'd need them to survive rather than simply to impress. He marked each day with a line on the stone, a ritual that anchored him to time, to sanity, to the passage of hours that otherwise blurred into undifferentiated darkness. He wrote to stay sane, filling pages with observations about the micro-ecosystem he was now part of, sketches of plants he'd identified as edible or medicinal, memories of his family described in such loving detail that Emma had to stop reading and simply hold the journal against her chest and sob. He documented a growing philosophical acceptance of his situation, quotes from Stoic philosophers he'd studied in college, meditations on mortality and meaning that showed a mind trying desperately to frame its own extinction as something purposeful rather than pointlessly random. But the journal didn't end in resignation or death. It continued for months, then years, the entries growing more sophisticated as the handwriting became smaller and more controlled, as if he were rationing even the space on the page. Marcus described how he'd learned to trap small animals, the trial and error of snare construction, the moral wrestling with killing to survive, and the eventual acceptance that squeamishness was a luxury of civilization he no longer inhabited. He identified edible plants, documented which ones caused digestive distress, which provided calories, which seemed to help when he developed infections or injuries. He described managing the psychological toll of isolation, the conversations he'd have with versions of his family that lived only in his head, the careful distinction he maintained between hallucination and memory, between hope and delusion. He mentioned hearing search helicopters in the first weeks, the agony of being unable to signal them, the realization that the canyon walls reflected sound in ways that made it impossible to determine if they were even directly overhead. He wrote about the day he realized no one was coming, that his family probably believed him dead, that his grave marker was likely already in place, even though his body remained stubbornly alive in this hidden fold of earth and stone. The later entries shifted in tone, becoming sparse, almost poetic, focused on the rhythms of the canyon that had become his entire universe. The quality of light at different seasons, the way the shadows moved across the walls, marking hours better than any clock, the behavior of birds that nested in the high crevices, the sound of water over stone that became a kind of music. He learned to read for changes in flow that predicted rain or snowmelt. He wrote about accepting that he might die here, that his bones might never be found, and finding strange peace in that anonymity, that return to the earth without ceremony or mourning. He described becoming something other than Marcus Chen, graduate student, son, brother. He was becoming Canyon, he wrote in year 7. The person I was is someone I remember but can no longer access, like recalling a character from a book I read long ago. If I were rescued now, I don't know if I could explain to them who I've become, or why I'm not sure I want to go back. The final entry, dated 9 months before Emma found the shelter, was different. It simply said, "I think I'm ready to try again. I've mapped the canyon walls for years now. There's a route. It's dangerous, maybe impossible, but staying here has become its own kind of death. I need to know if I can still choose something other than this. If you're reading this and I'm not here, then maybe I made it. Or maybe I'm at the bottom of a cliff somewhere and the birds have picked my bones clean. Either way, the waiting is over. If you're my family, I want you to know I never stopped thinking about you, even when thinking hurt too much to bear. I survived here, but I didn't truly live. That's the difference I finally understand." The journal didn't explain where he'd gone or whether he'd succeeded. Emma and the expanded search team scoured the canyon for 3 days, bringing in technical experts and climbers, documenting everything for the inevitable investigations. They found more evidence of long-term habitation scattered across the canyon floor, a second shelter near the far wall, caches of preserved food buried in sealed containers fashioned from found materials, crude but effective tools, including a remarkably sophisticated fish trap in the stream, and something that made Emma's stomach clench with a mixture of hope and terror. A rope fashioned from woven plant fibers, hundreds of feet of it, leading up a sheer rock face to a narrow chimney she'd initially dismissed as unclimbable. The rope showed signs of use, fibers abraded where it had taken weight. A technical climbing team ascended the route, placing modern protection as they went, and found it led to a hidden ledge system that, with extreme difficulty and risk that bordered on suicidal, could be traversed to reach a different part of the mountain entirely. miles from where the original search had focused. They found boot prints in the dried mud there, eroded but still visible, leading downslope toward a network of logging roads that provided access to several small towns within a day's walk for someone desperate enough to keep moving. If you want to see what happened next, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss how this impossible survival story continues. The discovery triggered a new investigation that exploded across news networks and social media. If Marcus had survived for years in impossible conditions and escaped on his own, where was he now? Why hadn't he contacted anyone? Why hadn't he walked into a ranger station or hospital or called his family the moment he reached civilization? The journal suggested psychological adaptation to isolation so profound that reintegration might have seemed impossible or terrifying. But was it enough to explain a man choosing to remain missing when his family had searched for him with such desperate dedication? Authorities expanded the investigation, checking hospitals, homeless shelters, ranger stations, and small-town police departments across 3 states. They pulled records of unidentified individuals, John Does treated for exposure or malnutrition, vagrant arrests, any footprint of someone living off-grid. Emma appeared on every news program that would have her, morning shows and true crime podcasts and documentary crews, holding up the journal, her brother's photo, pleading for anyone who'd seen a thin, bearded man in his early 30s, possibly disoriented or avoiding contact, possibly giving a false name, to come forward with information. The story went viral in ways the original Disappearance never had, spawning conspiracy theories and speculation. Documentaries aired within weeks, expert psychologists discussing feral adaptation and the fear of judgment that survivors sometimes experience, the shame of having put others through such grief, the difficulty of re-entering a world that had mourned you and moved on. 6 weeks after the canyon discovery, a librarian in a small town 200 miles east called the Tip Line. She'd been watching the news coverage with growing certainty that she knew the man in question. A person matching Marcus's description had been living in a converted garage behind an elderly woman's house for almost a year, doing odd jobs around the property, repairing fences and splitting firewood and tending a small garden with an intensity that struck her as unusual. He spoke little, avoided town gatherings, paid his rent in cash earned from day labor at nearby farms and construction sites. He'd given the name Michael Torres, said he was recovering from a difficult divorce and wanted quiet to figure out his life. He kept to himself, was polite but distant, and had seemed deeply uncomfortable the one time the elderly landlady had tried to take his photo for her Christmas card. When deputies arrived, they found him splitting firewood in the yard, his movements efficient and unhurried, the rhythm of someone who'd learned to make every motion count. He was gaunt, weathered far beyond his 33 years, his hair long and shot through with premature grey, his hands covered in the kind of calluses that came from years of rough work without gloves. When they said his name, Marcus Chen, he stopped mid-swing and set down the axe with great care, as if it were a ceremonial object that required respect. He didn't run, he didn't protest. He simply stood there, looking at them with eyes that were calm and impossibly distant, and asked in a voice rough from disuse if his sister was still looking for him. The reunion was not what Emma had imagined during the 1,000 times she'd rehearsed it in her head. Marcus was evaluated at a regional hospital, found physically healthy despite his ordeal, his body adapted to function on minimal resources, but psychologically altered in ways that resisted simple diagnosis. He wasn't traumatized in the conventional sense of flashbacks or panic attacks. He was transformed, fundamentally changed at some level that the psychological assessment struggled to capture. He struggled with crowds, with noise, with the speed of normal conversation that seemed frantic and unnecessary to him. He'd spent so many years in silence that words felt clumsy and excessive, like a language he'd once been fluent in but had mostly forgotten. He remembered his family with clear affection, but also with a detachment that hurt them deeply, as if he were recalling beloved characters from a novel rather than people who'd shared his life. He explained, in carefully chosen words during the evaluation sessions he tolerated but didn't embrace, that after escaping the canyon, he'd wandered in a state of shock, walking for days on autopilot, sleeping rough, avoiding contact. He'd been unsure if he wanted to return to a world that had continued without him, afraid of becoming a spectacle, a story people would tell at parties, a curiosity rather than a person. He'd needed time to remember how to be human in the way society required, to rebuild the social reflexes that had atrophied in isolation. Slowly, painfully, over months of tentative contact, the family worked to rebuild connection. Marcus attended therapy sessions, though he questioned their premises, finding it difficult to accept that his adaptation was pathological when it had kept him alive. His parents wept, raged, celebrated, grieved for the decade lost, cycled through emotions they couldn't name. They'd gotten their son back, but he wasn't the son they'd lost. He was someone adjacent, familiar but foreign. Emma was the one who understood him best, perhaps because she'd spent those years learning the language of wilderness herself, because her own transformation into searcher had given her a glimpse of what it meant to choose isolation as purpose. She didn't pressure him to explain or apologize. She simply hiked with him, matching his pace on the trails. He insisted he needed to walk regularly, letting silence be enough, understanding that words were often inadequate containers for certain kinds of experience. They'd both been shaped by the same absence, molded by the same mountain, and that shared geography gave them a connection that needed no translation. Marcus eventually agreed to speak publicly once, at a press conference arranged by the foundation his parents had built. He explained his choices as best he could, thanked the searchers who'd risked their lives looking for him, asked for privacy going forward, and made it clear he had no interest in fame or media attention. He wanted only to live quietly, to work with his hands, to remain close to open spaces where he could breathe without feeling the weight of human expectation pressing down on him. The revelation of how long he'd survived alone became a case study in resilience and human adaptation, cited in wilderness survival courses and psychological literature, analyzed in journal articles about isolation and identity. The canyon where he'd lived was thoroughly documented and mapped, given unofficial names by the research teams, becoming a cautionary tale about how terrain can conceal and protect in equal measure, how the wilderness keeps secrets with indifferent efficiency. Marcus's journal was archived, with his permission, at a research library specializing in extreme isolation experiences, available to scientists studying human psychology under duress, to survival instructors teaching worst-case scenarios, to families of the missing looking for hope that sometimes disappearance doesn't mean death. His family's foundation shifted focus based on the lessons learned, advocating for improved communication technology for backcountry users, for better geological surveys that might identify hidden hazards, for supporting mental health resources for survivors and their families who had to navigate the complicated terrain of reunion after trauma. They worked to change the narrative around survival, to acknowledge that coming home didn't always mean recovery, that some experiences changed people in ways that couldn't and shouldn't be erased by therapy or time. Emma eventually returned to design work, but she kept hiking, kept training search dogs, and served as a consultant for missing persons cases across the western states. She no longer searched for her brother. She searched for others, carrying forward the stubborn hope that had sustained her through a decade of not knowing, giving other families the gift of answers, even when those answers hurt. Marcus took a job as a forester working in fire management, a position that let him live on the edges of wildness without being swallowed by it, that gave him purpose without requiring him to pretend he was the person he'd been before the canyon. He wrote occasionally, short essays about solitude and time, published in small journals that appreciated his spare, deliberate style, his refusal to provide easy morals or redemptive narratives. On the 10th anniversary of his disappearance, Marcus returned to Whitethorn Ridge with Emma. They stood at the old trailhead as fog rolled in, just as it had that October evening so long ago, the weather conspiring to create symmetry. The forest was unchanged, indifferent to human drama, eternal in its cycles of growth and decay. Marcus placed a hand on the nearest pine, feeling the rough bark, the living pulse of sap beneath, and said quietly that he didn't regret the years lost, because they'd taught him the difference between surviving and living, between being found and finding himself. It wasn't the kind of wisdom anyone would choose to gain, he said, but it was the wisdom he had, and rejecting it would be like rejecting the person he'd become. Emma asked if he'd ever want to go back to the canyon, to see it again now that it was accessible through documented routes. He shook his head. That place had saved him and unmade him in equal measure, he said, and he'd carried its lessons out with him, carved into his bones like the tally marks he'd left on stone. He didn't need to revisit it to know it was real. It lived in him now, in his hands that couldn't stay idle, in his need for silence, in his discomfort with walls and crowds, in his understanding that home was a direction rather than a place. They turned and walked back toward the parking lot together, two people shaped by the same absence, bound by the shared understanding that some disappearances end not in tragedy or triumph, but in transformation, and that the hardest journey is always the one that leads back home. Behind them, the fog thickened and the forest closed in, keeping its secrets the way it always had, promising nothing, revealing nothing, simply existing in its ancient, patient way, while humans came and went and told their stories and tried to make meaning from the randomness of rock and water and time.